Now I want to introduce a wonderful man, Jim Leonard. Jim is a native Idahoan, born and raised in Salmon, Idaho. With the draft looming, Jim joined the Army to take advantage of their warrant officer flight training program, and after a short and intense Army career as a dust-off pilot during the Vietnam War, he returned to Salmon and worked in heavy construction before attending the University of Idaho and earning a BS in mechanical engineer, which led to a career with Idaho Power. It is my great honor to give you Jim Leonard.
I'm the only one that gets to hold the mic.
You got to give it back.
Well, I hope I can make this interesting for you all, but I did serve as a dust-off pilot. This looks like a volunteer shirt, but it's the Dust-Off Association shirt. So anyway, as Sue said, I was born and raised in Salmon. I'm going to tell you a little about myself, a little bit how we prepared for Vietnam, a little bit of the history of the early days of dust-off and how it achieved the traditions that it had in Vietnam, and then tell you about my tour in Vietnam and what it was like at that time. I graduated from high school in 1966. I did not want to attend college. I was a little bit of a rebel, perhaps, I don't know. I was taking flying lessons. I always wanted to fly. Did a lot of my flying in the backcountry when I was just getting my license. Of course, the next spring, I was 19 years old, and the draft was going to be after me pretty quick. The Army had their warrant officer flight program that would guarantee you flight school if you could meet their requirements. And thinking that a career in aviation was going to be something that I wanted, I decided to take advantage of that. What was required was that you be able to pass a flight physical and that you pass the Army's FAST test program. It was Flight Aptitude Suitability Test is what that stood for. I went to Salt Lake City and did a 3-day battery of tests trying to get qualified for that. I did make it. I did qualify. I was selected for flight school. Again, I was 19 years old. So the way it worked, when you enlisted for the warrant officer flight program, you only enlisted for 2 years, which was the same as a normal draft commitment. If you got drafted, you were drafted for 2 years. The idea being that if you washed out of flight school, you would have the same commitment that you had as a draftee. So it was kind of an incentive to keep people from making that big commitment. The Army needed lots of helicopter pilots then, so they were looking for us guys. So I enlisted. Since the Army knew we wouldn't be going to any advanced infantry training, they wanted to give us a basic training that was as similar to the situation we'd have in Vietnam as they could conjure up here in the United States. So all of us guys that were going to flight school went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. Fort Polk is not considered one of the nicest forts in the United States. But we made it through that, and then it was off to Mineral Wells, Texas for our primary flight training. Actually, before we started flight training, we had a month of pre-flight training, which was basically your military orientation, a lot of harassment, a lot of late nights, cleaning your barracks and just a lot of military stuff. The military was trying to teach us to be officers at the same time they were trying to teach us to fly. So we were kind of combining flight school with OCS, and it was a pretty intense program there for a few years, a few months. We started our flight training, and once the flight training started, it was kind of interesting how the military harassment kind of declined because they recognized that we needed a basic amount of sleep to perform our duties, and we couldn't be deprived. So anyway, we did our basic flight training. I've got a couple stories about that because I think they're kind of pertinent. But we would fly in the mornings and then have classroom studies all afternoon for a week, and then the next week we would rotate, giving us a chance to fly in the heat of the day as well as the morning. One of the things I do remember specifically about learning to fly a helicopter is that hovering is a great milestone. Once you learn to hover the helicopter, or as we used to say, find the hover button. And of course there was no hover button, but we had to find it. And I was just at the point where I could almost hover the helicopter, but I would start to drift backwards, and then I'd overcorrect it, and I'd get all crazy in the sky. The instructor would say, "Let me have the helicopter," and we'd try it again. And finally, we were in this big training field with a row of trees along one side of it. He said, "Let me have the helicopter," and he took it and flew over to that tree, the tree line, and backed up with the helicopter about, it seemed like the tail rotor was maybe 2 feet from those trees. It was probably 20 feet, but it seemed like it was closer, and he said, "Okay, you've got the helicopter." And I did not drift backwards. So from that point on, I could hover the helicopter, so we went on with our flight training. Most of us soloed the helicopter with no prior flying experience. I had some, a lot of the kids did not, in 12 to 15 hours. And then we continued our basic training, which was how to fly the helicopter, how to navigate, cross-country flying, all that. Later we moved into the advanced training, where we did more, kind of tactical use of the helicopter, landing off airport, refining our auto rotation skills, just the finer points of flying the helicopter. A couple stories from that, and again they're pertinent to later on in my career. We would fly out, our company, our platoon would fly out to a staging area, and the staging area had 6 runways, little short parallel runways with a building in the middle of them and kind of a classroom. And we would operate out of those staging areas for our daily flight training. And in Texas, in the late summer, there were wild cantaloupes growing in the grass between these runways. And the instructors would have us rolling those cantaloupes around on the ground with the skids of the helicopter to practice our hovering skills. And it was a little bit challenging. And then they'd say, "Okay, smash it." And so you'd kind of try to get the skid on top of it, and the green cantaloupe would squish out to the side, so then you'd have to go find it again and try it again. But that was part of the refinement of our hovering skills. Another thing that we did that was kind of interesting, we had confined areas all over the Texas Hill Country, and those confined areas were marked with tires, and the white tires were the easier places to get into, and then we had yellow ones, which were more difficult, and red ones, which were the advanced places, more difficult flying conditions, tighter obstacles and terrain and stuff. But again, on hovering, I had an instructor, and all instructors did it a little different. All instructors were ex-Vietnam pilots. And I had an instructor that would have me stand the tire up with the skid of the helicopter and then try and roll it across the ground with the skid. That was quite challenging, but a skill that came in pretty handy later on in life. I was flying a Hughes TH-55, the Army called it. It was the Hughes, the civilian version was a Hughes 269. It's still being made. They call it the Hughes 300 now. It's a little 2-place helicopter. We had 4 platoons in our company. 2 platoons flew the TH-55s. 1 platoon flew H-13s, which is the bubble bell you see on MASH. The other platoon flew the H-23, which was a Hiller version, very similar to the Bell. So we got through our training at Fort Walters, and we went to Fort Rucker, The first thing we did at Rucker was at our instrument training. We flew H-13 helicopters that were set up with a full instrument panel and a big hood over it so you couldn't see out. We did our instrument training. We transitioned into the UH-1 where we learned to fly the Huey. We flew all versions of the Huey except the C models, which we have back here. We did not have any C models in flight school. We had A's, B's, and D's. And it just depended which one you drew, what you flew that day. We transitioned into the Huey, got proficient with that, and then did 25 hours of tactical training, again, where we were doing a lot of low-level flying, nap of the earth flying, following rivers down in South Alabama and northern Florida. If we were above 10 feet, we all got nosebleeds because we were too high. But we finished our flight school, kind of an interesting thing. You've all heard of Huey, you heard it right at the beginning. Our flyby graduation, which was typical, was a 48 helicopter formation in Visa 3. And if you can imagine 48 Hueys flying by at 500 feet, it's a pretty impressive sight. Yeah. So that was kind of the flight training we did, and you know, the Army needed helicopter pilots. They were graduating about 150 pilots every 2 weeks. One class would be warrant officers, like myself. 2 weeks later it'd be a class of officers, mostly first and second lieutenants, and then another warrant officer class. So about a third of our students did wash out of flight school, didn't make it through for one reason or another, couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't handle the flying, couldn't handle the military discipline. Whatever it was, they washed off. I managed to graduate pretty well in my class, and most of the guys were given a wish list. Not many people got what they wanted because the needs of the military were foremost. On my wish list, I put in that I wanted to go to Army Maintenance Officer School, which was really a pipe dream because nobody got that unless you were an engineer or a prior service with military, with helicopter experience. My second request was medical evacuation. And of course the Army was all over that because they needed dust-off pilots. So I went to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, the Army's medical center, and went through a 6-week course called Essential Medical Training for Medical Service Corps Officers. And what that basically amounted to was the biggest thing that we learned that we used was triage and how to determine which patients had to go and how badly they were injured and which hospitals they had to go to, and a little bit about hospital organization, a little bit about medical procedures, but mostly Army hospital procedures. I got through that course, got a little bit of leave, and I was off to Vietnam. A couple stories about that I think are also pertinent. I arrived at the Overseas Replacement Station in San Francisco in September of '68, and I asked the receptionist where is a good place to have dinner. And she said, well, there's a shuttle bus leaves in a half hour that goes to the Presidio, and the officers club there is wonderful. So I thought, well, that sounds cool. And of course, we were going to Vietnam. We were going to die in a week anyway, so it didn't matter what we did. I jumped on the shuttle bus to go to the Presidio, and here I was, the absolute lowest ranking, almost newest officer in the entire US military. And on that bus, there were about 4 or 5 generals and 4 or 5 bird colonels and a couple lieutenant colonels and maybe a major and a captain, and then me. And boy, I felt pretty intimidated by my surroundings. I was still trying to learn what it was like to be in the military and what my role was and how it all was going to work out. But anyway, I took the shuttle bus to the Presidio and I had dinner at the Officers Club. I don't remember what I had or what it was really like other than it was very nice. But I got done and I was about ready to get a cab back to the overseas replacement station, and I thought, you know, I've got nothing else to do. I'm going to go for a walk. I was in uniform. We all were. That was the way we did it. And I left the Presidio, which is right at Golden Gate Bridge, and started walking and thinking it doesn't matter where I end up. When I get tired of walking, I'll get a cab and go back. So I ended up walking and ended up downtown on Broadway Street in San Francisco, which is not surprising, but I did, and I spent the night down there drinking way too much and everything. Again, in uniform, by myself. Got a cab, went back to the overseas replacement station. The next night, a bunch of my friends had arrived at the overseas replacement station, and there were 5 of us, and we went downtown, again in uniform. And the reason I say that is I think it kind of gives a little bit, we all talk about how badly the Vietnam vets were treated, and we were. I never experienced it very personally, but I know we were. I experienced some of it, but in 1968, that hadn't really happened yet, and I think that's kind of important to realize the difference. That was before the My Lai incident had become public knowledge. That was before the shootings at Kent State, and we were not disrespected walking around San Francisco in uniform at night. I just think that's kind of an important distinction about that war, because we hear so much about the bad. But anyway, I got the 5 of us that went out that next night. One of the places we went was the Playboy Club. I don't remember much about that either, but we did go there, and it was very nice, and we had a drink or two, and we went back. Our plane left at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we headed for Vietnam with a stop in Hawaii for fuel, and got to Vietnam. And I arrived at the replacement station there at Long Binh, and the next morning I was picked up by somebody from the 57th Med Detachment. The 57th Med Detachment was operating out of Long Binh then. We were attached to the 45th Medical Company. And now I'm going to go back a little bit and tell you a little bit about the history of dust-off in Vietnam, and then get you up to where I was there in '68 when I got there. The very first Huey helicopters were the 57th Med Detachment, the unit that I was part of. And the 57 took 5 A-model Hueys to Vietnam in April of 1962. A little bit about the Huey. The Huey was developed at the request of the Surgeon General. It was built to be a medical evacuation helicopter. It was used for everything, but that was its design intent. The basic requirement was that it be able to haul 3 stretchers internally, and that there would be room for a medical assistant, a medic in the helicopter. So anyway, that's, and the Huey was the very first turbine helicopter in U.S. military history. It predated all the Sikorskys and all the Air Force and Navy stuff. The Huey was the first. I think that's kind of significant because the basic design became one of the most iconic military aircraft of all times, and probably the most time-tested and war-tested of any military aircraft. The A models basically looked like our C model back here. They were a little smaller in all dimensions. They were a lot less horsepower and smaller than that. But looked the same, had the same sound. And that sound is really important to those of you who were grunts on the ground in Vietnam. Anyway, Captain Temporelli took those 5 Huey helicopters to Nha Trang, and they were the only Hueys in Vietnam. And it's important to note, when he went there in 1962, there were 12,000 troops in Vietnam. And they were trying to figure out what their mission was. They were trying to figure out how to deploy these helicopters, how to get them in the areas where they were needed, how to manage the communication. They had no spare parts because there were no other Hueys. They had, fuel was a problem. Logistics in general were a huge problem for them. But they soldiered on, and they evacuated some people. They fought to keep their helicopters. The transportation companies wanted those helicopters because the Army had the old H-21s, they had H-13s and H-23s, and those ground commanders thought those Hueys would be a wonderful thing, and why were they being wasted doing medical evacuation? Anyway, they prevailed and kept the Hueys. Then in early '63, the unit moved to Saigon because a lot of the fighting in those early days was down in the Delta, what we call 4 Corps, later Southern 3 Corps and 4 Corps. But they moved down to Saigon to help support the Delta. The unit was taken over by Major Spencer in early '63. By then there were 16,000 people in Vietnam. It was going gangbusters. They got 5 brand new B-model Hueys. B-model Huey is the same size as this helicopter, different engine, different rotor system, but basically that configuration. The thing that Major Spencer did that was really significant, and I'm always asked this, is he recognized the need to simplify the communication system where the guy on the ground could get the request for medical evacuation to where it needed to be so they could get evacuated. He went to the Department of Navy in Saigon, and at that time the Department of Navy controlled all the call signs and all the radio frequencies in Vietnam. And he laid out his plan. He said, we need a dedicated call sign that avoids any confusion, and we need dedicated frequencies. The Navy evidently agreed. They went through a list of call signs that they had set up to be used in the future. And most of them didn't apply very well to medical evacuation. They were like Bandit and Raider and Cowboy and things like that. But on down the list someplace was the Dust Off, and he said, well, that works, let's take that. So from that point on, the medical evacuation in Vietnam went by the call sign Dust Off. Wow. And we all used the same frequencies. Everybody on the ground knew how to get a hold of us. If their request went back through their chain of command, through their communication system, then they got a hold of us, and we got the message to go. The next major event that happened was in 1964. Major Kelly, who had been a commander of the 57th Med Detachment, a new medical detachment went to Vietnam, the 82nd, and they were stationed at Soc Trang. As was typical when the new unit came from the States to Vietnam, they put some of those pilots in the existing units, put some of the experienced pilots from the 57th and the 82nd, so they could cross-train. So they had some experienced people in both units. Major Kelly switched from the 57th to the 82nd, went to Soc Trang, and it was there that he earned his Medal of Honor. That, by the way, was posthumous. He was flying in a very, very hostile LZ, ordered several times to leave, to come back later after it was more secure, and he uttered the words, "When I have your wounded," and then he died. That kind of became the mantra for Dust Off, when we have your wounded. And if I break down a little bit, bear with me, I'll get over it. So that's kind of how Dust Off got started, how we developed into the unit that we were, and a little bit, the first thing I remember being told when I got to Vietnam, I moved into Hooch with a captain, and he said to me, I don't remember the exact words, but in essence he said, "This is Mr. So-and-so's room. He won't be flying helicopters again. I'll take questions later." Okay. He had refused a mission. And that was just kind of a warning. We don't turn down missions. We go whatever. So anyway, I was assigned to the 57th. The 57th had 6 helicopters at that time. And we were attached to the 45th Medical Company, which was out of Long Bend, there where we were. They had 4 platoons. They kept 1 platoon at Vung Tau, 1 platoon at Lai Kay, and 2 platoons at Long Bend, and we operated as a 3rd platoon of the 45th. Our heliport was right at the front door of the 93rd Evac Hospital, right along the highway there in Long Bend. And we covered all of 3 Corps, a little bit of 4 Corps, and a little bit of 2 Corps. The way it was covered, medical evacuation was never assigned to any specific unit on the ground. We did area coverage. We took care of everything from GIs to South Vietnamese Army to Viet Cong to guard dogs to pregnant women to kids that had got blown up scrounging brass in the battlefield. Whatever it was, if there was a medical emergency, we were called. We had field standbys. We operated out of Long Bend, but we also kept field standbys. And a field standby for us meant we would send a helicopter to an area. We'd make arrangements for housing and for food in that area. The helicopter would stay there 4 or 5 days, helicopter and crew, and we would cover all the emergencies in that area. And the whole intent was to get our helicopters close to where the fighting was going on. As Judy talked to you about earlier, the golden hour was kind of our mantra. We wanted to get that guy in the hospital, and we did. We kept helicopters in Tay Ninh and Tan An. We kept helicopters in Van Thiet, Black Horse. Believe it or not, Saigon was a field standby for us because at that time there were no dust-off units stationed in Saigon. And actually it was one of our worst. We had the worst living conditions there. It was a hassle to get food, so we often ate sea rations when we were in Saigon. But that's another story. There at Long Bend, we kept 2 helicopters on what we called first and second up. We kept a helicopter on third up and a helicopter on fourth up. Well, what first and second up were the helicopters that responded to the emergency calls, and we just rotated. The first one took the first call, the second one took the next, and so on. Some days you were busy all day long, some days second up never flew. But that was just the way we covered it. When you're in the field at the standbys, it was a little bit different, but you were the only helicopter there at that time. Our third up helicopter did hospital transfers, hauled blood, hauled supplies, hauled the nurses, new guys that were assigned to some unit. We had taken them. It was more of a air taxi operation. And the fourth up was a helicopter that crew did not have to remain on instantaneous call. They were on a 1-hour call, and that was basically just to have a helicopter and crew available if somebody else got shot up. So they were available on a 1-hour basis. Talk to you a little bit about the mission that we flew in Vietnam and part of what we did. What made us so special, and not, well, I feel like we were special, but we always flew single ship. most of the helicopter units in Vietnam, there was either a whole flight of them or there'd be 2 helicopters minimum. We were always single ship. And we always flew. It didn't matter if it was daytime, nighttime, the wind was blowing, it was raining, whether you could see or couldn't see. When we got a mission, we went. We were unarmed because of the Geneva Convention. Medical Corps were not supposed to carry offensive weapons, so we carried personal weapons. We all carried a pistol. We like to have a couple M16s in the helicopter. Some different crew chiefs kept different supplies in the helicopter, but we were unarmed. We landed where the wounded had fallen, if at all possible. We didn't pick them up at aid stations. We didn't pick them up at hospitals. We did that, but we picked them out in the bush if they were out there. A little bit the way the mission worked, when a unit would have a wounded, they would contact Dust Off either directly on our frequencies or through their tactical frequencies, and that would get relayed eventually to our ready room. We had a radio operator in the ready room 24/7, and what he would do, he would get as much information about the situation on the ground that he could. The location, the coordinates of where they were, the number of patients, the kinds of wounds, whether the people were litter patients or ambulatory patients, any other special medical needs. He'd get frequencies and call signs of the unit on the ground. He'd get anything he could get about the tactical situation, the weather, the terrain, any information he could get, he would get. As soon as he had that information gathered up, he would blow the siren, and probably in many cases blew the siren before he had all that information gathered up. When the siren went off, the pilot and the crew chief and the medic would run to the helicopter. The aircraft commander would run to the radio room, and the pilot would crank the helicopter and start getting buckled in. Crew chief and medic could get ready. By the time the aircraft commander got to the helicopter with an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with everything he knew, the helicopter would be running, and while he was buckling in, we'd be pulling pitch and heading out. And the aircraft commander would give us a message. He would say, head south, or head up towards Lai Kay, or head out towards Vung Tau, or he would give us a general direction. We did no flight planning. We did not plan a flight. We didn't have time to plan a flight. Our flight planning was done en route. The navigation was done very basically. It was time, heading, and airspeed. You'd know where they were, and you would head to their direction. When you started getting close, you'd start communicating with them on their tactical frequencies and establish communication. Oftentimes, one of the first things you would ask is, do you hear a helicopter? We did that especially at night. And they'd say, yeah, we hear a helicopter south of us. And you'd say, can you shoot a flare or strobe light? And so we would locate each other and plan our approach and plan our landing. One thing that we always had access to as Dust Off, we could get guns whenever we wanted them. By guns, I mean gunships, other helicopters, artillery, naval air, Air Force air, whatever was available, we could request it, and we would always get it. But we very seldom did request it because of the time involved. And going back to that golden hour, we didn't want to wait for the gunships to get there. We wanted to get the patient. Now, oftentimes our mission would be to a hostile area where there was a gunfight going on, where there was active combat area. In that case, there would often be helicopter gunships on station or the Air Force or the Navy, or, you know, you never knew what you were going to have. We would arrive on station. When we got there, we would run the show. We would plan our approach. We'd find out where they were, get an idea of the terrain. We would plan our approach. And I say all that as if we took time to fly around and figure it out and everything. This was all done in seconds. And you'd decide how you're going to go in, and the guns on station say, we'll cover your left flank, and the Air Force would say, and we're going to keep working out in this area off to your right front. And we'd say, okay, we're going to come in low level, just south of here. We'll pop over that tree line, land, turn our tail, and they'd say, okay, we'll all cover you, and away we'd go. We'd come in, typically we'd be at about 1,500 feet, because by that, at that altitude, you were out of most of the small arms fire. We would do a very fast descent, faster than an auto rotation to the ground. We'd come in low and fast. Low was anywhere from 2 feet to maybe as high as 3 feet. But we'd come in as low as we could. We'd take advantage of the terrain and the vegetation for cover if we could. Usually when we got to the LZ, we'd do a real quick stop and a fast pedal turn. We usually like to keep our tail towards where we expected enemy fire to come from. I say enemy fire, I back up a little. You know, the hot missions are the ones you all think about and remember and stick in your mind. But a lot of times we were picking up a guy that chopped his axe when they were making camp the night before, chopped his foot with an axe, or wrecked a Jeep, or had malaria, or whatever. We did all those too, where it was just like landing in a hayfield and picking up a guy. But you never knew, because even those routine ones, the Vietnamese seemed to always know when dust-off was coming. And since a helicopter was such a big trophy for them, they would lie in wait till we landed. And that was the way they worked. We'd get the patients on board. The crew chief and medic would load the patients. We could take 4 stretchers pretty easily. We could take 4 stretchers and 4 ambulatory patients real easily. Beyond that, it just got to be kind of a zoo in the back of the helicopter. I've had as many as 23 people in a Huey helicopter. The heaviest load I ever had was 19 GIs. The 23 people, 19 of them were Vietnamese, so they were smaller people. Both of those were at night. The helicopters would not have flown in the daytime because of the density altitude. But they needed a hospital, and we gave it a try, and it worked. So we would get them on board. Our medic and crew chief would go to work on them if they needed to. They did CPR, they applied bandages, they tried to control bleeding, they tried to calm the people that were all disturbed. And by the way, that crew chief and medic, we were a team, and we were a close-knit team. When we got into on-site was when they really started to shine. They had generally sat on the side of the helicopter with their legs dangling out the side right behind the pilot's seats. And they would be directing us, especially on our approach, about obstacles in the way and what was underneath us and whether we could land or not land, and help us onto the ground. And as soon as we touched down, if we could touch down, a lot of times we loaded patients at a hover. We'd drag them into the helicopter. We did hoist missions on occasion. We did not like to do hoist missions. Hoist missions are very dangerous, especially at night, for everybody, because you're very vulnerable, and there's not much you can do if things start going wrong. But anyway, that crew chief and medic could work on those patients all the way to the hospital. We'd contact the hospital, tell them we were coming, how many we had, what the condition was, and we would drop them at the hospital, and we would go away. And we would go back and refuel and sit back down on the hot pad at the hospital and wait for the next one. Our typical mission in Vietnam was about 45, 50 minutes. And that included from when that siren went off till we got out, got the patients, got them to the hospital, got refueled, and were sitting back on the pad. We did a lot of flying at night. Typically, we used to say about a third of our flying was at night. The last month I flew in Vietnam, almost 50% of my flying was at night. Night made everything more difficult. For one thing, you had to leave your lights on to avoid hitting a tree, and lights make a really good target. So we tended to put our lights on, shoot the approach, and turn the lights off, and get on the ground as fast as we could. A little interesting story I like to tell because it's kind of an emotional one for me. But as I said, once we dropped our patients at the hospital, we never knew. We never knew if they lived or if they died. Turns out if we got them to the hospital, most of them lived. Judy and her crew took care of all of that. But we had a crew chief, or a medic, Jim Curtis, and he got the bright idea one time to make up some cards. And the cards had on it, on the front was just your typical Army BS. You have been evacuated by the 57th, the best medical evacuation unit in all of Vietnam. And you can thank the following. And you'd turn it over and you'd have medic Jim Curtis, aircraft commander, pilot, and crew chief. And he'd fill these out and put them in the guy's shirt pockets. He did that for a while, but he soon learned that it was futile because, as you know, the first thing that happens when a patient gets to the hospital is all of his clothes are cut off and thrown in the trash because they're covered with mud and blood, and he may not even know the extent of his injuries. You know, if he has a major injury, he may not know his left foot's gone. So they would cut them all off and throw them away. So it became obvious that that was a futile attempt, but he did it for a while. Well, in 1968, just 50 years after we were in Vietnam, we were having a reunion, and there was a Brownwater Navy guy, Mobile Riverine Force, that had been picked up in the Delta. We kept a helicopter on the Navy's hospital ship in the Delta. That was one of our field standbys. That was a good one, because eating in the wardroom was nice. And one of our guys picked him up, and they got him to the hospital, and that's about all we know. Well, then 50 years later, he was getting ready to downsize his house, and he was leafing through a book, and he found this card, and he didn't even know what it was. And he figured out it was from when he had got wounded, and 57th Med Detachment, and he thought, I wonder if they've got a Facebook page, and sure enough, and he posted a picture of that and said, does anybody know what this is? Well, we had another medic, not Jim Curtis, that knew what it was and had been looking for one of those for 50 years. And he got a hold of him and said, yes, I know what that is. Where did you get it? Tell me the story. Well, we ended up inviting him to come to our reunion in St. Louis in 2018. He was wounded in '68. In 2018, we were having our reunion. He came, and Jim Curtis does not come to our reunions, just is not mentally ready to do that yet. And the pilot is deceased in a non-military, I'm not even sure how, but the aircraft commander and the crew chief that picked that guy up and saved his life in 1968 were there, and they met for the first time. That was pretty touching story. I know that's kind of what we did in Vietnam. I know all you grunts know the word dust off, and I know you all know the sound of the Huey. And it was a challenging job, but it was one that I really appreciated. And when you picked up a guy in the field and you could see his buddy on the radio and he would say, "Thanks a lot, dust off," and give you a thumbs up, you felt like you were Superman, and it was a pretty nice feeling. I did get wounded on my last mission in Vietnam. I did spend a year in the hospital. Never was going to die, but I was kind of broken up. So I appreciated my time doing that, and I appreciate all the work that all of you guys did to allow us to win the war in Vietnam, which we did, by the way. Oh, one last thing. I was given strict instructions by John at the end of my deal to let you know that this isn't a normal P-51D. This is an H model, and it's a very rare airplane, and he wanted me to let you guys know.
I'll tell you a little more about that in a second, but first, let's thank this wonderful man for telling that story. Dust Off Pilots.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll take just a couple of questions because it's so late, but then Jim's happy to stay here and talk with you, and he'll be down by the Huey after this is over, so come on down. Anyone have a question? Pardon me? What does Dust Off stand for?
I'll tell you, I have a hard time telling that story because that came way later in life. In Vietnam, we never heard that. But there's and I can't even recite.
It's on the Dust Off cabinet back there.
Yeah. And it's a nice thing. It's an acronym. But Dust Off was simply a call sign that was chosen out of a book.
And that is the truth. Any other question here? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
No, I never did. A lot of people here have, but I never did.
Tell what the question was.
Had I ever met Ed Freeman? Yeah. Yeah, I've heard all good about him.
He used to come here and teach kids, by the way. He was a great man. He's buried up here at the cemetery. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. A little over 200 medical evacuation helicopters were lost in Vietnam. By the way, I do have some statistics here. I got all excited and forgot to tell you. Dust Off flew 496,000 missions in Vietnam. We hauled over 900,000 patients. Altogether in Vietnam, there were about 3,000 Dust Off pilots throughout the war. We lost a little over 200 helicopters, and we lost a little over 200 men. And the other little story, I told you about the 5 of us in San Francisco that night and why that was pertinent. 3 of us were in the same hospital together up at Fort Lewis after we got back from Vietnam. That gives you some idea
of how life goes. Well, Jim will be out down by the Huey after this is over, so one more time, thank you for coming. Appreciate it, Jim. He's definitely my hero.